This seminar series, this is the second talk we have in our seminar series for funders. The US Research Software Engineering Group has been reaching out to different funding agencies to talk to them, and for us to give a chance to, answer any questions that those agencies might have. So hopefully this will be something of a dialogue, or at least a intro into a dialogue, if that's what you want. And, we're happy to give our opinions and as a community. The last speaker asked us some questions, and then we did a follow-up after we had some time to talk about that, and sent an email back and just kind of discuss some different topics for NASA. So without further ado, thank you for your time. I'm going to turn it over. Do you have access to share your screen and all that fun stuff if you'd like?
Yep. So let me kick over to that. Everybody see the slides?
Yeah, it looks good. Thank you.
Awesome. So hi, I'm Josh. I'm a program director at the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Let me start by saying, I was saying this to Nasir earlier, I welcome, as I'm talking, I figure what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out the high level framing of the foundation, my programs within it, some of the ways that the world looks from the perspective of a private philanthropic funder of science that's interested in scientific software. At Sloan, we're somewhat idiosyncratic. I think you'll get a sense of that. I think every private foundation is kind of idiosyncratic in its own way. So I'm happy to go in whichever directions people are interested in talking. Please interrupt. I've got the chat window open here, and I'm happy to answer questions along the way. Feel free to just speak up or throw something in the chat if you have a question as we're going. I figure I'll talk I probably have somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes of things to say. I can digress further if nobody else has questions, but I imagine it'd be much more interesting, as Blake said, if this is more of a conversation. Let me start with a little bit of overview of the foundation itself. Here's the obligatory foundation mission slide. I never quite know exactly from how first principles to start, excuse me, in a conversation like this. And I no longer have the window of everybody's faces up because I'm screen sharing. So what I can say really quickly, because private philanthropic foundations in the US are kind of an interesting feature of the landscape. At a very basic level, we are a nonprofit organization whose job is to give away money. We don't take in additional money from outside the foundation. The foundation was set up a bit less than a century ago by Alfred P. Sloan. Mr. Sloan was not the guy who created General Motors, but he's the person who figured out how to build it and run it at scale for decades. So he's responsible for GM. He did three things with his fortune. He had a history of cancer in his family, and went in with his partner, Boss Kettering, and they created the Sloan Kettering Research Institute, which then merged with Memorial Hospital and became Memorial Sloan Kettering. He thought people should learn to run a business the way that he believed businesses should be run, and he went to his alma mater, MIT, and said, I would like you to start a business school. And nobody had really had business schools before. So he endowed the Sloan School of Business at MIT, the first sort of modern MBA granting institution. And then he took all that was left over and created the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and charged us to support basic research and public understanding of science, technology, and economics. I think over the years, we've broadened that to science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and economics. Broadly, we focus across the natural and social sciences, with a bit of a boundary at biomedical research. We tend to think that Mr. Sloan's legacy in that was Sloan Kettering, and so we don't really fund health or biomedical research directly. But that right there is the sort of broad mission statement. In practice, the way the foundation is structured is in a set of programs. All told, the foundation's endowment is, I think, I forget exactly these days which side of the boundary we are, but we're at about $2 billion. Again, no money has been added to the foundation since Mr. Sloan capitalized it. So there is an investments team whose job is to grow that endowment. at a rate that ideally over time balances out to inflation plus 5%. That's a little hard these days, but that's the general idea of their side. And I'm one of 6 program directors. Our side of the house our job is to spend 5% of the total assets of the foundation every year. That's the rule from the IRS that enables us to have a sort of tax preferred, tax beneficial status. And that money has to be, we have to be able to demonstrate either by pointing at the organizations that we fund or through separate justification that the grants we make in the world serve a public benefit. So that grant making sits to grants and total expenses of the foundation sit at around $100 million a year. That puts us not at the level of a Gates or a Wellcome or arguably a CZI. We're sort of like one notch below. Also, the sort of biggest foundations are often run in a I wouldn't say a more what I'd say is we are just at the upper bound where I can sit down around a table every Wednesday morning with the other program directors, and we can discuss every grant that anybody wants to make, which is what we do every Wednesday morning. So the grant programs, which are up on the screen now, the bulk of what we fund, these boxes are not exactly sized to sort of dollars spent. If they were, then the research one would be a good bit bigger and the other is sort of a bit smaller. But the bulk of what we fund is research, particularly disciplinary or question-driven research in the natural and social sciences. We have an economics program. We have a program on energy and the environment. We have a couple of basic science programs, one about the transition from matter to life, one around small-scale particle physics, et cetera. We've had a number of those cycle through on a sort of usually 5 to 10 year horizon. Some last longer, some wind up transitioning away after a decade. We also was talking, came up in a conversation before this started. We also fund the Sloan Research Fellowships, which are a collection of early career fellowships that actually go back to the very early days of the foundation to fund early career research in a set of scientific disciplines, from physics to chemistry to computer science to earth and planetary science. Beyond those, the core research programs, which again tend to be more question-driven and disciplinary or interdisciplinary in nature. We have a public understanding of science program. Most people know us particularly from our support for NPR or public broadcasting, or our books program, which has supported works like Hidden Figures, or our theater program. We have a diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM higher ed program that's largely thinking about pathways, particularly into and through graduate programs in the sciences. We have a very modest New York City program because we live here and we try to do good in the city where we work. And then there's the program that I'm responsible for that probably is closest to home for everybody here, which is the technology program. I have been at the foundation about 12 and a half years, and I was brought on to build the technology program. It's not that Sloan didn't fund technology before that. And in fact, technology, whether software or instruments or other things, gets funded throughout all the other programs. But there was a perception at the time, and I've tried to really take this to heart in building the program, that there ought to be a kind of engagement with technology in the research enterprise that is distinct from the particular needs of any one discipline or any one particular research project. What that I'll get a little more detail about what that means in a second. But at a high level in technology, from the first decade of my time at Sloan, we worked in 2 main categories: data and computational research and scholarly communication. About a couple years ago now, we went through a strategic review and we actually sunset those and shifted really to a core focus on the role of software in science, alongside a set of exploratory programs that I'll talk more about. And we also have a small universal access to knowledge program that funds Wikipedia and the Internet Archive and sort of broad access to knowledge. The current state of the technology program, this is what it looks like today. Again, we have a core programmatic thrust focused on the role of software in science. We have certain themes we're focused on. One, like we think a lot about open source. We think a lot about archiving and preservation, and actually the role of software in scholarly communication systems. And we think a lot about training and careers of people who build and maintain software. Separately, we also have an exploratory program. The way that we'll often talk about that is this is where we think there's something interesting going on, but we don't quite, we have questions. We don't have like clear strategies or clear ideas of how to apply our grant dollars to advance practice. So we've been making grants for a handful of years around open hardware, thinking about the analogies between software and hardware in research contexts. Have been making some grants around trust and algorithmic knowledge, which has morphed over time. I think it started off thinking about like disinformation in science. These days, where we, like everybody else, are trying to figure out the implications of generative AI for research. And actually, another area that in the past couple of years has become particularly has felt particularly salient and is an area we're spending more and more of our time is thinking about the role of technology in facilitating collaboration in research. I think I think about the story of the past few years as going from what felt like normal practice to everything being filtered through a few technology platforms for a period of time, and then swinging back to some sort of a hybrid state. But we're really interested in what how technology can help facilitate how we want to design the role of technology in facilitating scientific collaboration, and that can mean using the kinds of tools that we're all on Zoom right now. I think it can be about using Zoom in more interesting, more constructive or creative ways. It also honestly can mean, different technologies. Thinking about what are the affordances we'd like to have or that researchers would like to have. So that's a very early exploratory area, but something we're thinking a lot about. In total, the technology program, excuse me, the technology program has an annual budget of, with a bit of error bars, plus or minus, but basically about $11 million a year in funding. What that means is that we are honestly a drop in the bucket of the overall funding landscape for science broadly, even for technology and science. It also means that we think very carefully about what are the places that those dollars can be most impactful, because what we do have is a lot of flexibility and agility, and can think about things in different ways than other funding agencies. My own academic background is sort of at the intersection of the history and sociology of science and information science. I haven't written production code in a long time, and I'm not the guy you would want doing that these days, but I understand the technical systems enough that, but I think about things sort of holistically. I'll often say that I think about socio-technical systems, and that's about people and technologies and the interaction between them. We'll get to more of that in a minute. Our grants tend to operate, they can be everything from, a summer project up to a 3-year in duration. We usually don't make grants longer than 3 years because there's a hesitance to commit funding for that long a period, because we are at the mercy, the available resources we have are somewhat dictated by the performance of our endowment. We can smooth that out to somewhat of a degree, but we tend not to commit for like 5 or 10 year stretches to a particular project. I'll also just say, for the kinds of technology projects that I've funded, I've tended to fund on a shorter time cycle than even 3 years. Often we'll do 18-month to 2-year periods of funding. And because we can be, it's not at the level of sort of, an agile, development process, but because we can deploy resources somewhat more quickly, the timeline from initial conversation about a grant to actually like having a contract signed and a check moving out can be on the order of a month or two, depending on the particular size of it and the time in our grant cycle. So, and the last thing I'll say is, on average, we make total of 30 to 40 grants a year. That is partly constrained by our budget, but also partly constrained by the amount of work it takes to process a grant. I know there are a handful of our grantees on this call. we, in our process, and I can say more about the process if people are curious, tend to be a bit more, we're able to be a bit more hands-on and iterative than I think maybe larger federal funders or some other organizations. Working with us often is a process of a series of drafts and a internal and external review, rather than sending in an application and then waiting a handful of months and then just receiving an answer back. So, if no questions about that, then I guess I'll move ahead and say, so this is there are particular themes or particular topics that we're interested in and make grants around at any given time. But if you cut through like the history of the technology program, there are really kind of three core kinds of things we support: technology, people, and institutions. So I'll just say, got one slide on each. So with regard to technology, obviously that's the heart of the program. We are, as I said, we're not the only place at Sloan that funds technology. Our energy and environment program is funding a lot of computational modeling right now, as in fact is our Matter to Life program. The Sloan Digital Sky Survey has funded a substantial amount of software development around the instrument. Our economics program has been really interested in the economics of privacy and has actually done a tremendous amount of work from basic research all the way through to implementation and applications of differential privacy and other sort of privacy protecting capabilities when thinking about sensitive data sets. However, the technology program has been a particularly unique place to fund. I'll often say we don't really go down to the hard metal of computing, but we will go a notch or two down the dependency stack to try to think about how you support critical dependencies, critical infrastructure that isn't tailored to any one particular discipline. Often people will write to me and say, here's this project I'd really love to support, and I'd love funding for, and the first heuristic that we'll go through internally when discussing it is, okay, does this really fit in one of our research programs, or would it fit in a particular research program that we don't have? If that's the case, then it's probably not a fit for the technology program. Over the years, we've got a couple of examples of grantees in here. We particularly found a sweet spot over the last decade of doing a lot of funding in the Python kind of data science ecosystem, and so thinking about things like Jupyter, NumPy, those kinds of those kinds of projects that I think also often have fallen through the cracks of traditional sort of project-oriented funding. Maybe you could get bits of funding around the sides of something that would be a more conventional research project, but we've really spent a lot of time thinking about how to direct money directly at those kinds of sort of middle layer infrastructural projects. We also have a strong orientation towards, particularly these days, a strong orientation towards open source. I think it's always important to say that's not a dogmatic license discussion for us. This is always a dangerous thing to raise, and there are a lot of different views on it. When I talk about open source, I'll often say I think about open source as a verb, and I'm really interested in open source as a contemporary modern open source as a way of facilitating and managing distributed work, and thinking about the governance and the contribution structures around software. And actually, we're spending a lot of time thinking about how you reconcile open source as it shows up out in the broader world, as it shows up in industry, as it shows up in sort of just enthusiast communities, and academic knowledge production, academic institutions, academic systems. Reconciling those incentives and those ways of working is not always easy, and that's something that we're very much thinking about. The other thing these days that we're thinking a lot about is, particularly as other funders have been coming on board to provide direct funding to individual software projects. I mean, the incredible impact of CZI's Essential Open Source Software Program, which has been fantastic to see, has partly meant that, and that's led the way to things currently happening at NASA and NIH and NSF and DOE, and so it's thrilling to see. What we've been repositioning to think about is actually the practice of software engineering, and particularly the tooling around software engineering. Things like platforms for code review I mentioned on here. I think there are a couple of grantees here on this call who are thinking about interaction design or UX. We've gotten really interested in technical debt and how you assess it and how you know when to allocate resources towards it. Things like continuous integration and how it interacts with, scholar communication systems. So there's a whole host of issues like that we're spending more time thinking about, kind of in the category of tooling for software engineering. So I don't know that I actually have at my hand numbers, but I think the technology funding is like the first thing that we think about, because that's sort of at the heart of the program. The second thing we spend a lot of time thinking about is people. Obviously, you all included, we're thrilled to have been and hopefully continue to be supporters of US-RSE. I think we have a history of thinking about new professional roles or critical professional roles that are the human or the social side of research infrastructure. Data scientists, research software engineers. We've spent, for a lot of the last decade, we spent time thinking about how data science capacity was being built in institutions. And one of the clear lessons of that was it was largely about people and about skilling up people in different parts of the research enterprise, from graduate students to postdocs to dedicated staff, to the PIs who are leading and often writing grants, alongside our turn towards software and foregrounding the role of software in research. That's where we really have pivoted and are spending a ton of time thinking about research software engineering as an identity and a career path. And as we say on here, one of the things that we've tended to do is believe really strongly that community is important to not just that professional identity, but also that career durability. I mean, I don't need to sell you all on the value of US-RSE, but as an instance of the kind of community, we tend to think that that's incredibly important. The last area that we're spend time, and this may be looming in people's minds because we have a call out right now. I mean, that first bullet, we get really, I'll own this. I get really excited about bureaucratic innovation. I may be the only person who would say those words that way, but I actually think there's a tremendous amount of power and opportunity in figuring out how to creatively innovate in the bureaucratic structures. Before working at Sloan, I worked at the New York Public Library. That is a 100-and-something-year-old institution that is not supposed to turn on a dime, but also has to navigate a rapidly changing technology environment. I think that universities and research institutions, I believe deeply in them. I think they're incredibly important, and I think it's incredibly important to figure out how to help them to adapt and innovate to changing technological contexts, changing research needs, and so that's part of what I think we think about our role at Sloan as doing, is providing seed capital for that kind of institutional and bureaucratic innovation. I'm also very aware that at times it's not just about the actual dollars, but having the Sloan logo on something. We were very intentional these days. So we have 6 logos up here of the organizations that we funded to create open source program offices. We have a call out right now for other institutions to launch open source program offices. The idea of that call is partly to help people who are thinking about software development and thinking about open source in their respective institutional contexts to have enough of an impetus to get people around a table and to be able to say to other institutional stakeholders, to a vice provost for research, to deans, to people who help decide where money gets spent, to give them enough of a reason to sit down and have a conversation about how they would respond to something like that. And that's partly about the dollars, and it's partly about the sort of prestige and imprimatur of the Sloan Foundation. That's another resource that we often try to use to legitimize different kinds of work. When you can make a Sloan grant to support a kind of work that maybe people didn't think was fundable or didn't think was prestigious, that makes certain people in a university or in a research institution, perk up and pay attention. And I've had a number of stories of grantees of ours who were funded for a particular project getting pulled into conversations about other funding opportunities because there's a sense of, oh, well, Sloan liked what they did. Maybe we should get them into some other conversation. That's very much the strategy. And like I said, we have that call out now. I'm happy to, speak more to that if people are curious about it, but we also have a couple of webinars next week set up to discuss that. I think let me close with this, because I think this is actually one of the most useful things I could say right now. It can often be really difficult to figure out how to interact with a private foundation. We are idiosyncratic in the way we present ourselves. There is no standardized process across private foundations for working with them. We also generally don't operate necessarily at the same scale as a federal agency. So it can seem like a lot of work to figure out how to get money from us, or how to pitch an idea to us. This is a screenshot from our website. If you go under I think sloan.org/grants/apply, or just click on apply. We ask people to send in letters of inquiry. This right here already seems way more imposing than I think we need it to. And any opportunity I have to an audience, I'll often say, there are a lot of people at institutions who will agonize over, the polish on a letter of inquiry that'll go through sponsored programs, it'll go through other things. From our side, what happens is a letter of inquiry gets sent to me, and I read it and I discuss it with my team, which consists of Liz Vu, who's the program associate on the team, and our program assistant, and that's it. It's to us, and so the thing that I always want to say to people is, we don't have, with the exception of something very targeted like that OSPO call right now, we don't have specific calls for proposals. We consider things on a rolling basis, and what we need to do is start a conversation. And the best way to do that is to reach out with us and pitch us an idea. So the bullet points here are just the core things that are useful to us to know whether it's worth both of our time, whether it's worth our time and your time to have a conversation about a proposal. And that may happen by email, that may be setting up a time to talk. My goal is always to get as many compelling ideas as possible. Like, I'd rather get more inbound letters of inquiry that are not polished, that don't represent a huge time investment, that are just literally, hey, here's this idea I have. And then, the less investment that any of you or anybody else makes in sending us a letter, if it's not a fit for us, we'll try to get back to you as quickly as we can. I am not always the best at that. We are sometimes snowed under, but we do the best we can, and we do not lose track of things. So we'll know that it's there. It may take longer because of internal budgeting or other internal priorities, but the two things that I always want to say in any conversation like this is the bar to sending us something should be low. It should be, if you think it's compelling, send us a paragraph or two and let us know how much it would cost or what the budget looks like. That's all we need to know to know whether it makes sense from our end to start a conversation. Send us a few ideas, and if you don't hear back from us, nudge us. I will just say, again, there are times that our focus gets pulled in one direction or another, and if there's something you really haven't heard back from us on, or something that you're curious about, don't hesitate to write and nudge a bit. We're doing the best we can with a very small team. So I think that is about all I really wanted to cover right now, and hopefully gives you at least a high-level view of the foundation and our programs and the way we think about things even more, which I think is the main goal that I wanted to get across. We have a link for our newsletter, and yeah, I'm happy to open up for questions. I'm gonna stop screen sharing.
Yeah, so maybe I'll step back in again.
You look at metrics like having more contributors and a healthier maintainer sort of pool of community.
Yep. Yeah. So, I think there are a couple of answers to that. One is in terms of relative positioning. There's a sense in which I think to an organization like Software Freedom, or the broader, what I think of as the broader open source landscape, I think our interests seem very niche and somewhat provincial, because we are interested first and foremost in scientific research. And so, so in the same way as I think there's a sense in, there are a set of heuristics that I think about, which is like, is this a unique fit for us? Are we particularly well positioned to fund something? If it is infrastructural, sort of well beyond the scientific context, if no one else is stepping up and helping to support something that's critical to research, maybe we'd be able to make a case. We've actually, over the years, been finding that devoting a small portion of our budget to collaborations, particularly with, I mean, these days with the Ford Foundation, the Omidyar Network, and Schmidt Futures under the Plain Text Group, not under their science program arm. We've been working with them around general broad questions of research on digital infrastructure. And there, I think part of our goal is to make sure that science is at the table in those conversations. But as a funding consortium, we are looking more broadly. So I think we try to maintain awareness of those broader things, but there is sort of a particular specialization. And I think that's not just because we do science and we're focused on people who are writing software in the interest of science. It's also that I think there are, and I can say this, and I'm really interested in your takes too. I think there are some unique attributes of software development in the service of science. I think there are a lot of cases where it can be similar. There can be cases where it's more, there are more edge cases because scientific research often is most interested in the edge cases. It also may be that, and also the incentive structures for doing that work, what it means to receive credit for work, how you know if the work is valued can be very different. We've actually been spending research, we've been making grants over the past few years to some people who are trying to think about how you knit together, to your second point, metrics like contribution or, particularly the role of the maintainer in a project, how you reconcile that with academic incentive structures. And so I think some of that is going to be about actual metrics data. We've been funders, for example, of the Chaos Project, which is thinking about community health metrics, and I think alongside actual like code metrics of an individual's work in a code base, understanding the health of a particular project can also be important. That's very much stuff we're kind of thinking about.
Okay, thank you.
One other thing that I would say is, alongside software freedom, there are certain, we've worked a lot with NumFocus, we've worked a lot with Code for Science and Society. I think there are a few organizations that are positioned particularly in that research software or public, kind of context. I don't know if it's fair to say it's a different layer of the stack, but they're sort of highly resonant but distinctly different contexts. Yeah. David, I see you have your hand up.
Thanks, Josh. And thanks for the talk. This is somewhat related. It's less about metrics, but as long as we're on the topic of like infrastructure.
Yeah, sure.
I saw you had like UI UX, and that was one thing that came up at our kickoff workshop.
Yep.
And so can you just say a little bit more about that? I mean, in my space, like Python, there's a lot of like, often it's like, I wish there was a GUI for this, and that's still sort of a pain point. So I wonder if that's part of it, or is it more like researching what APIs are easy to work with? So that's just what I was curious about.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of the right way to look, and I'm also gonna respond, but I'm also gonna invite Lavanya, who is on the call and is one of our grantees, thinking about UI and UX as well, if she has thoughts. The thing that I would say is in the thing we're talking about internally at Sloan, and this has really been driven by my colleague, Ms. Vu. So full credit. I want to be sure to assign credit there. I think there's a really interesting set of questions around the role of UI UX in scientific research software in particular. I mean, again, there's a sense in which it's research software. I mean, it's software. Any software has an interface. Any software has some form of interaction design. In the case of research software, one of the things we've been thinking a lot about and trying to understand is, how do you know how much effort a given code base merits? If there's software that is written in one lab is only going to be used by people in that one lab, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of norms and training to help people understand how to use that piece of software, maybe it doesn't need to be the subject of tremendous investment around, it could still be the case if it's going to improve the productivity and performance and work of that lab to a degree. My sense is that software that is going to be, that you want to lower the barriers to usage, that you want to make more intuitive, that you want to make more useful. On one hand, I don't have a great language to talk about that as a set of heuristics yet. And one of the things we're hoping to do is help to support people who are going to cultivate more of that. And also, it's not just at the level of an individual project. One of the things that I've very much, learned from conversations with Lavanya is also the idea that there are also, like the idea of design patterns or common interface elements across different kinds of scientific software. Sometimes they emerge, sometimes they don't. Often things are just a little bit different each time, and there's a lot of overhead for users to do that, to make those sort of shifts. How much overhead, how much cognitive overhead is that, and how much does it merit? In the case of science, the issue is always, you can put money into that, but it's always going to come at the expense of more novel, more conventionally novel science. That doesn't mean that there aren't going to be cases where you want to make that trade-off, but understanding how to make that decision and how to allocate, resources or when to make those decisions. I definitely don't have a good way of talking about it yet. And I think one of our goals at Sloan is to just basically set up rather than even saying, here's the answer, to help set up those conversations in a more sophisticated way.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
So let's see. So I could go ahead. I wasn't sure if Lavanya was going to say anything or.
I think in the interest of time, we should get questions from Josh answered. I'm happy to talk about it more in a different context for sure. We've been thinking about these problems for a while. So.
Okay. So I had two kind of unrelated questions, which I'll just say both of them, and you can choose if you don't want to answer both of them at this point, but or other people. I guess one of them was just thinking about your question about bureaucratic innovation, and also your comment about incentives that you were just discussing. It seems like what you guys have decided to do is basically try to work institutional change by funding institutions to make changes individually, and maybe thinking of how some initial institutions help drive the case for other institutions to make similar changes. And so I guess I'm curious if you've had any thought about actually institutional incentives and a way to change the incentives to drive what institutions do, so that this could happen kind of more quickly or more on
right.
in some sense. And then the other question I had, which is kind of an unrelated one, a completely unrelated one, is just like thinking about this from the point of view of US-RSE, thinking about this, what the talk that you've given. Are there things that US-RSE could actually do that would help your program and help with the kind of shared goals that you and we both have?
Yes. So, all right, let me tackle the first one first, which is my general working model of how universities and research institutions function is that there is a good amount of a sense of competition and a sense of looking around and worry about, falling behind. I think that can be a sense of competition in sort of grants and like fundraising. It can be a sense of competition in talent acquisition, whether that's sort of, faculty and staff recruitment and retention, whether it's students. There can be a sense of competition in publications, how many articles in science did you get? Those kinds of things. There are always a number of those kinds of things. I think the way that I've approached, and we've done this in a handful of different places. We had funded for years, a program out of the Council on Library and Information Resources, which was about helping to establish data curation positions within academic libraries. So we started that 11 years ago, I think, maybe a little more. And that program was very much designed first to offer, again, seed funding to enable a university that maybe couldn't reallocate budget immediately. If you give 2 years of partial partial or most funding for a position, and then taper that funding, that's enough time to reallocate budget lines if the university actually feels that that's an important thing to do. So there's a first point, which is helping people playing certain kinds of roles, helping people enacting bureaucratic change to get enough of a runway to be able to demonstrate local value. So that's about how, I think that's my model of how you affect change internally. And if that works, then you can make a case and you can line up sort of faculty members with you and who say, oh man, this is really useful. Or you get written into grants and then there's dollars flowing in and that helps. I think there are ways of doing that. I'm really, really excited to see that model playing out in the establishment and scaling of research software engineering groups as well. I think that's something that I've been very much paying close attention to and learning a lot from all of you and from US-RSE. I think the second piece of it, Dan, to your point, is in some ways the higher impact piece, which is how do you leverage those investments into getting universities that aren't funded to decide that it matters enough to them to then put their own resources towards or to make those policy changes or to enact those bureaucratic innovations themselves, to adopt the things that came elsewhere. And I think we've seen that play out in different ways and with different degrees of urgency. In the case of academic data science programs, I think it happened very quickly because it was very clear that there were you could hang out a shingle and there'd be demand for a master's program in data science. The question for me had always, in that context, had always been, how do you make sure that that isn't another law school or business school, but is something that actually reconciles with and aligns with the research mission of the university and helps to bolster, helps to methodologically level up and support research across disciplines. In that case, in a case like that, I think the best thing to do is to talk a lot about successes. To, like, if anything, the most critical thing is figuring out how you surface stories of that local bureaucratic innovation that works in surface stories in one context, and ideally network a few different places where it's happening. That's exactly our strategy right now around open source program offices. We have 6 institutions that we've funded opportunistically. Our goal is to double that number, and then that's going to be enough of a community that with enough different kinds of institutions represented, that a vice provost for research who has faculty either saying, hey, I'm writing software and I have to figure out what the plan is for that software, or Dan, we've had conversations about whether this actually makes you more competitive for grant funding or not. But I think the best answer I have is a lot of visibility for those things. And I actually think one of the things US-RSE might be able to do, just to bring that home, I think figuring out how to project, not just as individual voices, but as an organization and as a community, how to project into those other spaces where people who make those kind of decisions exist. Whether it is AAU, AP, Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, whether it's, places where VPRs hang out, whether it's the American Library Association, where the library directors go, whether it's, those different kinds of organizations, and figuring out how to gain make your work visible in those contexts. That's something that I think, maybe it's very early for that now, but I think in the coming years, that's going to be a really useful strategy. As well as equipping all of your members and others with the kinds of tools and framings to be able to advocate internally, locally for those kinds of changes as well. I think playing institutions off of each other and saying, look, they're doing it really well, we're going to fall behind. That is a really powerful lever when working within institutional cultures.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that works in some cases, and in some cases it doesn't. And in some cases, universities seem to see that there's some competitiveness, and they can do something that maybe universities ahead of them aren't doing, and use that to step up. And in other cases, it doesn't seem like that happens. And I'm not really completely sure kind of in what situations it does and doesn't happen. And maybe this is getting kind of,
yeah. I'll just say one last thing on that point, because I think it hones something that I was trying to say, and I think may have articulated badly. And again, this is largely like my some of this is deeply influenced by my own training as a qualitative sociologist and ethnographer of science. So I think a lot about these sort of institutional and power structures. When I see that fail, when I see that sort of like trying to create FOMO move fail, often I think it's because it can be dismissed as, well, that wouldn't work here, or we're not like them. And so the more that that bureaucratic innovation can be seen as successful, but not idiosyncratic to that one institution, that's, I think, the sweet spot. So that's where I think what you all have is a network of people at a lot of institutions. And the more that you can not just tell those individual success stories, but be able to give a sense of a broader movement or a broader collective, rubbing those really, really sharp idiosyncratic edges off of some of the work so that you can tell the story in a way that it can't be just dismissed as, I see Ian's hand up. It's not just like, oh, that worked at Princeton, but it would never work here, and here's why. Like, I think you want to build up enough of a critical mass of, different examples so it can't be dismissed as easily. That's the best answer I have right now.
Okay, great. So speaking of Princeton, Ian?
Yes, Ian.
Hey, thanks, Josh. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your overall support of US-RSE and RSEs in general. This is kind of building off of Dan's question. You mentioned bureaucratic innovation, and I immediately thought of institutions defining who has PI rights. And RSE is falling very often, if not most of the time, into not having PI rights. And I'm kind of curious. I don't know if I have a question per se, but are there mechanisms? Do you have thoughts, comments on what your view on that is, and are there mechanisms by which RSEs can apply if they don't have PI rights at their institution? Are there ways to spur bureaucratic innovation to provide that where it makes sense? I'm just kind of curious.
So I don't want to get anyone in trouble here, or like, you're all living in your own institutional contexts. From my perspective, I will say, if the bar to sending me an LOI, and I think that this holds true for other private foundations at least, is having a functional email address. And so there have been cases where people have written to me with a project idea, and it has sounded great. And then, after a conversation, it turns out, oh, they don't have PI status. They're going to apply through somebody else. And there's a way in which someone in my role can be an ally in forcing some of that change. This is at a very small scale, though. This doesn't actually help with regard to, the real prize is being able to do that with like federal funding in the States, at least, because I think that's, having that PI status, that's where it starts to scale really dramatically. Because like I said, I make 30 to 40 grants a year, and that's, it can be incredibly powerful for the people who I can go to bat for and go to a sponsor program's office and say, look, this is the person doing the work. I don't want a sort of like in name only PI just to handle it because you can't figure out how to let this person like own the grant. That, and I've had those conversations. Inevitably, it has worked out where they're willing to make an exception, or they're willing to rethink some of their approaches. That's my own experience. I don't know that I have a good answer about how to do it more broadly, except that I think there is there's almost a bit of a ladder to climb. I think there's working with like, a one-off bespoke kind of grant discussion with a place like Sloan. I think, I think the CZI folks are going to come talk to you at some point. I think for something like the Essential Open Source Software Program, which when there are open calls like that, I think they can crack that door open wider to some degree. And it would be interesting to know how they're thinking about that question, because they're operating at a different sort of level of scale and a different kind of reach than we are. One other thing that I'll just say is in the context of some of the larger, just explicitly institutional innovation grants we've made, particularly the work around data science in universities, we pretty much mandated that the staff data scientists we were funding had PI status. That was essentially a functional need of the expectation of the grant. And a number of those folks then went and wrote grants and got more money. And I think once there's that, maybe another way to put it, and then I'll sort of stop circling this, is I think in order to gain that PI status, there's got to be a certain level of institutional sort of, you know, comfort and trust, but there's also got to be a sense that there's like money that you can uniquely bring in that, you know, isn't going to happen elsewhere. And I do think that as we start to see, you know, hopefully more funding opportunities that don't have software as a component, but that are primarily focused on the production of software, that will become production and maintenance and work around software and engineering. I would hope that we'd see that change. I don't have a better answer about like what the right, you know, knob to twist or lever to push right now is, but that's kind of how I think about the system. I'd be curious your take on it.
I think that's awesome.
How do you think about it?
I mean, frankly, I think you are turning knobs and pulling levers and by just doing what you're doing and showing RSEs and folks like that can have success, right? And
yeah,
success as being a PI that's dictated by the funding agency helps to raise awareness that there's value and there's sort of intellectual value to this kind of work. So yeah, great, thanks.
Okay.
I mean, if I could ask for a second, like anybody else does anybody else on the call, like, have they been through that process or like, you know, advocated or like are there any other stories about PI status that anybody has? I'd love to hear anecdotes. Yeah, Daniel.
I was exceptionally granted PI status when I got an EOSS funded. Basically, it was like you become a PI if you get the grant, and then it's sort of like a switch. So now that it's on.
Yep.
And I can apply for other stuff.
Yeah, I would say it does raise one interesting question, which is that I think is something worth for those of us in a funding role to think about. Are there ways of, because I meant what I said before, I'm very aware that I have two resources at my disposal at the Sloan Foundation. I have a checkbook and I have a logo. And the checkbook is the obvious thing, but it could be that there's a, you know, I thinking out loud, you could imagine a grant program that is not particularly high dollar, but, you know, is enough that it buys out maybe, you know, a summer of time or something like that. But would require that switch to be flipped because there isn't a cost to the university to flipping that switch, but they've got to actually do it. And if there's like enough motivation to do that, you could imagine, because one of the variables is just how much money we have available. But, you know, the logo and the imprimatur isn't a zero sum kind of resource. And so you could imagine something that would sort of spread that even more broadly than, I mean, and EOS has done that tremendously. It's one of the really compelling impacts of that program. And I'm just so impressed with the work that they've been doing. But you can imagine other things like that. I also think sort of, you know, prizes, you know, awards, those kinds of things, but those don't necessarily target that very particular. I think you're exactly right. You know, I've seen this before. Once that switch is flipped, then you're seen in a different light by the institution. Joel?
Hi. So I am the head of data for the Sloan Digital Sky Survey here at the University of Utah.
Hello.
Hi, nice to meet you. So we do all of the data processing, mostly because of the incredible cyber infrastructure that exists at the University of Utah. Yep. So 10 years ago or 13 years ago now, when I arrived here in Utah, the CHBC was beyond anything I'd ever experienced before. Without that, we would not have proposed to bring the central processing here to the University of Utah. But of course, now that it's many years later, what is on my mind is the lack of something missing in the existing cyber infrastructure. And it's right in between the hardware services, which are top-notch. And, you know, in SDSS, we have thousands of scientists all over the globe download their data from Utah and are equally top-notch. And what's missing is that role in between, which is the research software engineering role. And for example, my team at the University of Utah includes a lot of network specialists. And the software development becomes projects for astronomy graduate students. And since I'm a software engineer, I can organize them, and a lot of our tools are cutting edge. And certainly we've received multiple grants from the Sloan Foundation, for which I'm extremely appreciative for, related to sustainability and doing more than what we currently do. One example is, how do you get thousands of astronomers across the globe to collaborate with each other? And so we have custom software without which we would not be able to generate the amount of science that we currently do.
Yes.
So at the University of Utah, there's a call for this missing cyber infrastructure in between package, which instead of all the network specialists and the domain experts, the software skilled laborers in between. And one of the problems is, at a university, you either have a faculty position, you might have tenure, you might be a career line. So for my sustainability grant, I was able to hire an assistant, but it was not a permanent role. It was 18 months. And towards the 15th, 16th month, he was very happy he got to have another job. But it seems like it's extremely hard to propose a cyber infrastructure solution where you don't have desks and offices ready to go for these wonderfully talented people that are definitely willing to do the work. But it seems like without having centers of excellence set up, it's really hard to get started without having that core of software developers.
I mean, first, just yes. I think that, and the way I think about this is there's a startup problem there that's extremely difficult to, and I wouldn't say that I have answers or that I've seen people with answers. I think part of what we're trying to do with our funding is deploy resources in certain ways so that people can try to experiment and come to some of those answers. I think I was talking with Clifford Lynch, who runs the Coalition for Networked Information. I was talking with him yesterday. And he was using the phrase sort of research support services broadly to think about software, data support. That there are a set of things. I think it's a slightly different framing of this critical missing piece, but I think there's at a minimum a family resemblance across a set of needs that are a kind of very important, frankly, essential, skilled technical labor that universities don't really know how to hire. Now, the thing that I find hope in is that there are other job categories that universities have figured out how to hire in durable sense. I, for a long time, have actually thought that the best model we have is some of the organizational structures in academic libraries, because you have professional roles of different kinds, ranging from sort of reference librarianship to sort of collections development to other kinds of technical expertise. Yeah, Dan, I'll definitely email you the slides. And please, anyone who has to run. I'm happy to finish answering the question. But I generally just think the more that we can leverage job categories from other places, the grantees that I funded with the Moore Foundation around data science at universities very explicitly leverage job categories from libraries, from academic computing, into these different kinds of roles. A lot of that work is really idiosyncratic to the individual institution and how they handle it. Some of the work that I think US-RSE can do, and I know there was a workshop this past fall, I think the more you can both find allies with other people who are doing that similar kind of role, or pursuing that similar kind of agenda, and again, be able to tell the stories of how to make that, how that has worked in individual contexts. I think that at least lowers the activation energy. Some of it is also just getting the right leadership in place who are willing to take the leap and front some of the cash. Because I think my strong belief is that once you get one of those, once you really make that initial commitment, there's a flywheel that starts to run, and that can that really can help move to that sort of more steady state operation. But it's as you said, it's really that startup, and we just don't have the scale to make grants at the level that I think would be needed to be able to do that. So yeah, it's very much a problem that I see, and we're working on.
So just to follow up,
Yeah.
since the initiatives on the campus side are to build a lot of the cyber infrastructure for the end scientists to use,
Mhm.
by that self, that wouldn't really hire too many software developers to do actual work. So it seems like there's an opportunity here for the Sloan Foundation to fill out some of those gaps. And especially if you have a campus that's located in some area that's very focused on this, and they're doing a lot of the infrastructure, but perhaps there are individual PIs that would like to bring folks in, and that would require.
Interesting.
And of course, there would be hardware expenses because all of my work, because it's data driven, involves a lot of machines and a lot of custom software, which of course, thanks to SDSS GitHub, is open source.
Right.
Okay, well, I think with that we will end. And sorry, Josh, did you want
No, this is great. And the only thing that I'll say is, please, my email address is greenberg@sloan.org. If you have thoughts on anything we talked about, if you have other stories you didn't want to share on the call, or have thoughts on, what are ways of sort of prizing open some of the or levers that you think could be interesting for a place like Sloan to put pressure on, please reach out. This is the stuff that we're very much thinking about and excited about.
Okay, well, again, thank you very much. Just for anybody.
Thank you for having me.
For other people that are still on, as I put in the chat, we'll have NIH coming up next, and then CZI after that. And if anybody has ideas on people that they would like to have speak, please send a note to us. And we'll be back in about 2 months.
Thank you.